Okay, we're recording. So we just wanted to welcome you. My name is Beth Birmingham, and I'm part of the steering committee that's been incubating and creating this initiative called the Christian Alliance for Inclusive Development. And so we're so glad you're here today. And we really do want this time to feel more like a conversation. So this is not a long-winded, tons and tons of information presentation, because you've seen the website, you've been out on the platform, but really a time to hear some of the thoughts behind some elements of the Alliance, as well as a chance to answer questions you might have, and for us to be dreaming together. So, but Emily and I were quite, we've been impacted by all the things that have happened over the last few months in the news, and particularly right now with the Ukraine. And so we wanted to take just a moment to pause for a moment of silent prayer and lift up women around the world. You know, next week, as you know, is International Women's Day on Tuesday. And for all of us, we have our friends and our sisters around the world that we think of that are in situations where the news media never covers. Mm-hmm. And so we just want to lift those up in prayer right now, the women of Ukraine, the women in Syria, the women across Africa, every woman today who faces a challenge just for daily existence. And so just lifting them up in prayer, silent prayer, and then we'll get started. Amen. Amen. Okay, so as I said, we really want this to be a conversation. So if you want to unmute yourself, if you don't have too much stuff going on in the background, that's totally fine. We have the chat box open, so any questions you might have, you can pop in there or do the little hand raise thing, I think is enabled on this. Hi, Courtney. And yeah, let's make it a conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily to introduce herself and give a little bit more of her background in all of this.
Thanks so much, Beth. And it's exciting to see you all popping on the line, and just welcome. We're so excited to begin really this journey together, expanding the community around it. My name is Emily Sarmiento, and I work with Tearfund USA, who is kind of the behind the scenes host organization in terms of the operational side of getting this alliance off the ground. And yeah, we'll come into just in the conversation, even between Beth and me today, we'll share a little bit about the story of where exactly this came from, how it was launched. But I just want to give context. Beth and I have been colleagues in the Christian relief and development sector for about 10 years or so, I think now, Beth. We met when we were both serving on the board of the Accord Network, which is the trade association for our organizations in Christian relief and development. So we met on the board. I did a master's program through Eastern University that ultimately Beth was part of the leadership of developing out that program. And so I know her through the Eastern angle. And then ultimately we also overlapped in our tenure at Compassion International and journeyed together a bit through our professional experiences there. I'll say most recently we reconnected and really felt drawn of the Lord into this work here for the Alliance through the Wheaton Consortium on gender and development. And we'll talk about that more specifically, but I've been blessed to journey with Beth for about 10 years and was really excited when we really felt God was speaking about something. And so as Tearfund, we brought her on a contract to help us work through this and really dream and envision and build what this could become. So yeah, Beth.
It's been a good journey. So Emily and I were looking at the calendar, and it's been 9 months from the point we had that first meeting on the Wheaton Network Initiative to today. And so she commented that 9 months is to birth something. It's quite apropos. So yeah, I have 22 years at Eastern University, and then also as a consultant for about 15 years alongside many of the Christian NGOs that make up the Accord Network, and then had a few years serving in one in particular. So it's, it's just such a blessing to see this day come about. So how we approached this is last summer, just started praying and saying, Lord, throw up the doors if you don't want us to move forward, or open up the doors. And he just kept opening doors. And so we just held our hands wide open and walked on through. And the Lord has shown up every single step of the way. So last summer, we pulled together a steering committee because this really needs to be a community effort. And we wanted it to be a global community because we know where the needs are greatest for some of the things that this alliance can be. And so our steering committee are 14 women that you've seen on the High Bright platform, on the Alliance platform, from 7 different countries and all experience ranges. And so that's been a great blessing. And so that group has actually committed to meeting for the first 6 months, every 3 weeks, to work out everything from what do we call this thing? What are the values we want to achieve? What are the things that we potentially feel are, the initial needs of the community, so that we can at least just get started? Because the reality is, now that we have a pilot group, now that we start bringing women on, you are coming to help us actually build the table, is the metaphor that we're using. And so we want to hear from you and have, we'll speak to a few different ways in which we're going to consistently hear. So that was the steering committee. And then we started designing, what does the pilot look like? Because we wanted to try out, we're using new technology. So the Alliance is actually a gathering of women globally in 2 ways. One is the online sphere that allows us to reach women in parts of the world that don't have access easily to leadership development, to spiritual formation, to having a coach from somebody in the sector that understands their work, but also face-to-face gatherings. And so you'll see in October, we have our kickoff conference here in the United States, but we do envision in the future making sure that we are adjacent to other global events like the MICA Global Network Triennial Gathering. And then at some point, our vision is that, wouldn't it be great if this is spreading around the world with chapters? So perhaps we have the Kenya chapter or the Nairobi chapter, so you can sort of see the infrastructure where we're thinking, but that too needs to be member-led and driven by your needs and your desires. So you have come into this on the ground floor, and you were actually selected by your steering committee member as people who are roll up our sleeves and let's pour into something that would be passionate about the topic and have something to bring to the table. So if you think of this, if I can keep going on that metaphor, as a smorgasbord, we've invited you, we're the hosts, we've put a couple of dishes out there, but that does not make a full buffet table. The full buffet is filled by all of us bringing our dishes to the party. And then what a wonderful feast it will be. And so that's what we're looking forward to. So I hope you're excited about being part of something at the ground floor level. And that also means also seeing the warts. Technology is not perfect. The offerings that we put out there are, a lot of them are just placeholders. So if you're seeing my lectures from 8 years ago, please know that that's not intended to be forever content, but just to sort of give you an idea of what might be. So Emily, why don't you share a little bit more about the genesis?
No, that's great, Beth. I'd like to say I've used this a couple times with folks. Like, you are coming in on the ground floor because we're just barely up from the basement. So welcome to the ground floor, and that means we need all kinds of ideas and feedback to it. But let's talk a little bit about the basement, kind of where this came from. To even come up to this point. So Wheaton Wheaton College for a number of years, for 3 or 4 years now, 4 or 5 years, maybe even, Beth, I don't have my dates straight, but Dr. Amy Reynolds, who's in the sociology department at Wheaton, started this initiative to really study the intersection of gender and development and Christianity. So specifically, what are the gendered dynamics in Christian development spaces? And she called together a group of, I kind of say like a think tank. I don't know that she would use it. Network initiative is how it's always been framed, but really functioning as a think tank to look at data across the sector, look at research, and look at needed policies to affect positive change. And I had tracked through this a little bit with Beth, and when she was representing back when we were both at Compassion, and learned a little bit about the consortium. I had the blessing of being invited into a conversation last year and heard the recent analysis that Amy and grad students had based on studying 990s in the sector, based on studying websites, annual reports, and really piecing together the story of how are women represented in leadership and influence in Christian relief and development, and what are the broader stats around women's participation in the sector. And so that's where on the web, as you've seen, as you've come in, we have those core stats around currently within Christian relief and development spaces. On average, 15% of CEO and exec seat roles are held by women, and 25% roughly of board seats are held by women. So minorities there, yet we know 75% of the workforce are women in Christian relief and development globally, and 60 to 70% on average of the decision makers on financial support of Christian relief and development are women, and a primary percentage of stakeholders in the field or beneficiaries, program participants, are women. And so the group was really wrestling with, here's the reality, that we're serving women, we're dependent on women for this work, yet women are not predominantly represented in the strategic decisions and the resource decisions about how development takes place. And several of us got together after that last conversation with the Wheaton Consortium and said, this is brilliant data. It needs to be platformed. We need to have conversations around this, and we need to create pathways for change. And we want to do that in a really constructive, kingdom edifying way, but exposing realities and lived experience, and talking and bringing together collective brilliance to actually change it. So we really went forward from last year's Wheaton conversation saying, this is brilliant. It needs critical mass. How do we develop critical mass for the right conversations? And that is really what led to having this conversation. The data and knowing that we need to draw more people into studying it together and then bringing forward the ideas to solve it. We can incubate from that think tank and expand out, and we can also bring new ideas back into the thinking there. And we'll talk more in a second about how Wheaton and other partners strategically fit into this effort. But Beth, any more on the genesis there, or the basement up to first floor?
When you move to that next phase of how might we solve it, my business partner and writing partner, Ava Fallon and Zamard, had been working on an intervarsity book that will come out October 18th called Creating Belonging Cultures. And we've looked at, it's focused on gender justice and gender equality. Both of our backgrounds is faith-based NGO work. But we looked at the system that is required in order to address the cultures of our organizations that leave people on the margins, whether that be women, people of color, So really needing to address it as a systems approach. So you'll see when the book comes out, and as Ava and I are going to do a talk on the book soon, how we've kind of poured that thinking into at least the foundational level of what this alliance would offer to help start to move the needle on addressing some of that systemic challenge to it. So.
Yeah, and as we started to explore those conversations, with Beth, with Ava, with Amy, and with others through the Wheaton Consortium, and talking about how do we build critical mass around this, to have the conversations, to learn the new techniques, to look at the data together. We talked about where could we house a network, to get it off the ground and not create a parallel structure prematurely, which would mean additional costs and so forth prematurely. So through those conversations, Tearfund USA, the organization I lead, came forward and said we would be happy to provide the the back end in a community, supporting a community effort, a coalition effort. We're happy to provide back end services to get this off the ground. And that was a natural decision for us and fully supported by our board because we're focused on overcoming systemic poverty and injustice and gender justice within that. So both in the field work that we support around the world, but in terms of who we show up as here in the US and key programmatic focus areas for us, we want to see people flourish in their life callings of the Lord. And we want to see systems change so that they can. So for us, it was a very natural thing. Tearfund's history around the world, a core competence of our family is really convening, bringing people together to solve issues together. So for us, it was natural to say, happy to put a back office to this and really support what it might take to move this forward.
Yeah, and I was super eager to work with Tearfund in that because I was part of Tearfund UK's initial efforts when we created the MICA network back in 2000. And so again, as Emily said, it's part of the DNA of the Tearfund family to incubate and launch these types of networks. They launched MICA Global Network as well as the Integral Alliance, which some of you might be familiar with. So to speak to some of the other folks that are around the table, we realized that we wanted this to be an alliance, which means bringing together organizations who have this as a passion and a vision. Obviously, that starts with Amy Reynolds and the Wheaton Network Initiative on gender, Christianity, and development. So Wheaton and her work is a full partner in this alliance, specifically helping us with research, because research and doing research of our lived experiences, but also collecting data about our organizations will be critical, and we'll have to speak about that. The second one is a need for equipping and leadership development. And I know no better leadership development organization that is recognized globally than Development Associates International. And here in America, people might be like, who? Their primary audience has always been those outside the Western realm that doesn't have easy access to biblically based leadership development material. So they are a full partner, Jane Overstreet, CEO, at the table, and they've opened up their entire catalog of offerings to us that we might enjoy it without cost. From the startup phase. And then lastly, our pioneer who's been at this far longer than all of us is Mimi Haddad at Christians for Biblical Equality. And they are a gender theology group of theologians that have been operating for 40 years, and far too many of us were not aware of their brilliant work. And so if you go to their site and look at some of the amazing things they have published, but they too are bringing some of those offerings to the Alliance so that we have them as a theological partner in this work. And they're not the only ones. Absolutely, there are going to be others that want to come, but they're the pioneers who are helping to build this reality. And then as you saw on the platform, we have a new George, who is the executive director, IJM. We've got Catherine, who's with Compassion International in Nairobi. Karina Villacorta is a longtime World Vision International executive, and now as an executive coach in Peru. And Ava, I think I mentioned earlier, is my partner. She's the senior leader at World Relief. Emily, Jane Overstreet. Latasha Satterfield is on Tearfund USA's board, so she is our board liaison, and she's a pastor here in America. And then Nadine Bowers-Dutoit is a professor of theology and development in South Africa, and I've known her for years. And then Bibiana McLeod, some of you know, she's Argentinian, and she works for Medical Ambassadors International, but is focusing now on human trafficking for World Evangelical Alliance. Sarah Brackbill is also one of our leaders in this, talent management person at Compassion. And then Amanda Mia is on the call, and she's been our backbone in a lot of this work. as really the administrative leader in this from Tearfund USA standpoint. So having this Bright platform, every Zoom call you're on, that's because Amanda did all of that groundwork for us.
Yep.
So really appreciating that.
Yeah. So we see your note, Amanda. Happy for the opportunity. Yeah, we're so grateful for your leadership in this. I've thought a couple times, like, how do I explain this to people in terms of kind of the heartbeat? And part of it's sisterhood, sorority, community, fellowship, and we'll unpack a little bit more concretely, but with smarts, with technical smarts, and with game-changing plays. And so I just want to emphasize that this is not just a gathering just for the sake of it. We're all busy women, the people that we're inviting in, all the names that Beth just read off are extremely busy individuals, but we're committed to a vision of needed change. And there are specific changes that we want to see out of this effort. And the steering committee that Beth just named, we've been advancing how will we measure that change? How will we baseline, and how will we measure, and how will we attribute the contributions of the Alliance to bringing about that change? But you saw the change on the front page of the Alliance website. I mean, there are three broad categories that I just want to point us back to. And first and foremost, it's about individual women flourishing in their ministry callings. So we want to help individual women through the Alliance be able to fully live into their gifts and have more pathways to grow in those gifts and living that out within Christian Relief and Development. So certainly there's an individual outcome area that we're focused on. The next one is certainly diversity and a more egalitarian leadership across the sector. Looking back at those stats I just referenced of how underrepresented women are in leadership, we really want to influence change. And Wheaton has incubated some great tools and resources to help us launch some of that, both in terms of principles of gender equality in the sector, scorecard, either tools and resources we want to get into more hands to help bring about some of that diversification change within the sector. And ultimately, we want that because of the third category of outcomes that we're looking at. We know all corporate research would say where there's greater diversity at the top tables, greater missional outcomes, greater return on investment. And so while that data doesn't exist as robustly specific to the INGO sector, we want to help produce it. The logic is parallel to what we believe can happen here. And so we want to help prove and we want to help monitor over time how poverty alleviation is better impacted the greater diversity, the more balanced tables you have at the top. So we're very specific about keeping our eyes on women flourishing in their callings, diversity in the sector for the purpose of improved poverty alleviation outcomes. And we're committed to measuring that as we go.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's excellent. I think I will pull up the site.
That'd be great.
There's one piece, in case people don't notice, when you actually click on the About Us, there's content there. Some people fly right to the down arrow stuff. But the reason I want to raise that is it's the next point that we wanted to share. So here's the way we're conceptualizing what this alliance provides. And you'll notice, like every good NGO, we came up with an acronym: community, advocacy, restoration, equipping. And what does that equal? Care. Mainly because some of us need those kinds of things to remember when we're talking. So community, but each of these is very deliberate, because as I mentioned in that research that we did for the book and having to create a system approach to this, these are some of the elements of a system to move the needle for gender equality in the development sector. So number one is just bringing women together and finding a place of women and our male allies. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But building relationships, connecting both at a macro level and then on individual levels, being able to share lived experiences, being able to form groups and learn together on different aspects of this work, and regularly challenging one another, sharing job postings, encouraging each other to go for that next vice presidency, if that's your calling, if that's your thing. So the community part is key, because far too many women feel alone when they experience burnout in their workplace, harassment in the workplace, you name it, whatever the experience might be. And so in some other work that I've done, I find that when you bring women together, There is strength and there is comfort there. And there's a ton of male allies who want to be our support and who want to join us in this work and who are already doing it in their own organizations. And so many of the men that we've talked to are like, count me in, whatever you need. So the second piece that Emily just started to talk about was the research. So we put research and advocacy in one bucket. The reason we are, going to regularly seek your input, do an annual survey, things like that, is we need to start tracking about 5 or 6 key indicators that we can measure over time to start to demonstrate that we're moving the needle, not only for greater gender parity around our leadership tables throughout our organizations, but also starting to move the needle on the performance aspect of the organizations. So you'll notice we've got quite a few professor types that have been involved in this work who care very deeply about doing good quality research. And so every time you participate in a survey or some sort of focus group or whatever, know that you are contributing your voice to help us demonstrate that that case to be made, that with greater equality, we're going to see better performance in our organizations. And at the end of the day, that's what we care about, honoring Jesus by bringing our very best as world relief, as world vision, as Habitat for Humanity. So uniting in advocacy. So what does advocacy look like? This has been a question I get quite a bit. We can very easily call out the problems in the sector. There's other people that are going to spend their time doing that. That's not our game, okay? We want to do positive advocacy by celebrating the organizations that are doing well. So what if by 2023, we are starting to publish the top 5 large faith-based NGOs for women to work in, and the top 5 small to medium faith-based NGOs for women to work in. I promise you, when other organizations start seeing those lists, they're going to want to find out, how do we get on that list? And we will have answers for them through the gender principles, through some other very tactical things. And so calling out and celebrating what God is already doing in some really great organizations. And none of them are perfect. We're all on this journey. We're all on a spectrum. And we have our good days and our bad days, but we want to celebrate. Then we want to take that information to foundations and individual donors who say, yes, I am all for diversity. Love your statement on your website. We put a statement on our website too. And yet, perhaps the top 10 grants that they offered this year went to organizations that lack diversity. So if we're going to say we're about something, let's demonstrate and help you figure out how to ensure that your actions match what you say you're about. And again, positive, focus on that. And that seems to be a really appealing message to the foundation folks that I've talked to so far, and they've contributed already to the startup costs for this, because this doesn't start to become financially sustainable for a little while. So yeah, that's what we're looking at for advocacy. Restoration, that's a funny one. The messaging of the world, the messaging of our organizations, the messaging sometimes from our churches has led some women to believe that they are less than, that they're not created in God's image, that they're not called for all of his purposes and equipped for that calling. Sometimes it's a slow erosion. Sometimes it's a slap in the face. And so we recognize both emotional healing and having places to bring those hurts so that we grow beyond them. We're not going to live in a victim status. We're going to let God heal through spiritual formation, through emotional and trauma healing, and other things that we will be offering through this alliance. And even just being able to bring your lived experience to somebody else and tell them, hey, I was there, and I promise you it will get better. That's a message that a lot of women need to hear. And here's the place that they get to find that message. And then last one is equipping. For whatever God has called you to, it may just be expanded influence in the role that you're currently serving in, or perhaps you do have aspirations for a higher level position. Leadership development, practical things on developing your team, that's the things that we want you to tell us as the builders of this table, what would be most valuable to you. And that's what you're going to see in a survey that's coming up in another week or two. What are the kinds of topics that are most pressing for you now, or that you hear your colleagues around you saying, wow, it'd be really great if we had access to that. And then we will curate it, create it, find ways to provide it, invite you to come and provide it if it's an area of your expertise that you could share. So that's what we're looking at when we say we want this to be a community that offers care.
That's great, Beth. I'll pick up on that. To share, I don't recall if it's in our FAQs online, so forgive me if I'm overlooking something there, but part of coming out of the basement to the first floor, is this viable? Should we do this? We really spent time studying what other networks are out there, because we didn't want to waste time or effort or resources creating a parallel structure to something that already existed. And we found there's some brilliant leadership development networks out there. There's some brilliant spiritual formation or development networks out there. There's some brilliant, global networks, but we did not find something that married our faith foundations with technical skills development and in our niche sector of global relief and development. And so we're not trying to be all things to all people, although we would welcome anyone. Our heart behind this is really serve women and allies who are called into spaces of Christian relief and development where we know that faith is fundamental to the transformation that we seek. And so we believe there doesn't exist the same space. Yes, there are church leadership networks and those kinds of things, but the nuance is bringing together, like the Wheaton Initiative started, faith, gender, development, because it's all connected, and faith is what we believe influences the transformation we seek. So just want to lay that out, that we were very intentional to try to research. And as Beth alluded, we've been talking to a lot of people. There are a lot of names you haven't seen yet in terms of, is this viable? Would you get behind this? Would you put your name behind this? And, you see the steering committee and you're seeing the women who are invited into this initial cohort to help us figure it all out. And so you're starting to see some of those. But as Beth said, we've talked to some leaders in NGO seats. We've talked to foundation leaders. We've talked to other parallel Christian network leaders, and both vetting the idea, getting critique, but also saying, would you really help us take the word out when we're ready, when we've done the proof of concept, when we've gotten the initial feedback. And even before that, we had focus groups and surveys. So we've been building forward step by step. And this phase that you're in now, we have a concept, we have an engagement platform, we have a model, we have content possibilities, the smorgasbord that Beth said, but now we're really coming into a group to say, how does it feel? What's the highest priority of the choices that we've put together to date? And we want you to help us refine that so that we can go forward and we can bring in those other relationships who want to help us invite a much broader community into this place. So your builder's role is significant for us at this stage to be able to continue to take it forward.
Yeah, great point. Very good points. I'm going to stop sharing just so we can see faces once again. There we go. All right. So I think at this point, there'd be a good time to hear from you as you listen to those different elements of our early concept. What comes to mind? What questions did it raise for you, if any?
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Carla.
Just to remind myself, it's fine to just come off mute, right? Or would you rather us raise our hand?
Oh,
okay.
Totally.
Okay. So first of all, thanks for the presentation, and actually thanks you for allowing me to be part of this. I appreciate having the opportunity to contribute. So I'll say that first. And yeah, it does sound like, there's obviously a need. I can tell that all the work that's gone into it, there's definitely a need. I think the first thing that for me that has come to mind is probably linked to kind of this post George Floyd period. Obviously, I'm an African-American woman, but having worked in international development and having supported some initiatives to get, to help with localization and bringing African women, because my area of expertise is sub-Saharan Africa, into leadership roles in those countries. I guess I'm wondering as where this intersectionality is, especially if we're talking global, and you may be talking about Latin America and other parts, how to make sure those voices and those women are really part of this discourse, and how that measuring is done, right? Because I know it's based on gender, but there are definitely specificities, even in how these groups of women see the issues around gender. And I guess I'm wondering about how we're ensuring that it is not a, American-centric or Eurocentric vision as we move forward. And I guess I'll land there. I guess that's a question.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you want me to start there, Beth, and then
Sure.
you
sure,
pick up?
sure.
Yep. No, that's brilliant, Carla. And let me say this too. We do not pretend, we have many of the questions identified. We don't have all the right answers. And so truly that's where, when we say member serving members, we want people in the room to raise the right questions with us and focus the right answers, and not assume that it's about us to deliver that. It's about the community to solve it. But how do we bring the collective wisdom, the global wisdom, to solve some of those things? And very intentionally, it's unfortunate that Beth and I, two white Americans, are here leading the conversation today, and we're very cognizant of that. And we have been very intentional that the steering committee was not us. It was not just the two of us. If you look across who has spoken into this, we are here today representing them, and as a function of schedules and as a function of being the original two in the room, but it can't go forward as us. I will say one thing, just one kind of carve out of nuance that is important. We are focused on US headquartered sector. We're not trying to, and I say that as I'm a CEO at a table with 11 other CEOs in the Tearfund family, and having conversations with them. The rest of the world doesn't have the same issues around gender and faith in development that US headquartered institutions have. And Europe is much more evolved. Asia Pac countries are much more evolved in terms of their thinking about gender and development. We have some unique nuances that tie into some of the same racial reckonings that we've come into, the white nationalism, the Christian patriarchy. There are things that are unique to the US context that influence US headquartered organizations. So I do just want to say we are focused on agencies that have a US headquarters, but their workforce is global, and their women experience gender dynamics that are a product of multiple layers, right? It's a product of the patriarchy that's been exported, the white nationalism that's been exported, but it's also local culture, and it's also local denominations, and it's local, many, many different layers. Beth can speak to that from some of the research into her book, but the point is we don't have a silver bullet for that fix. We want the community to engage in that fix. And that's why we very intentionally have women from Africa, women from Latin America, and women from Asia on the steering committee, just to help us be able to point in a direction that we can build forward for these kind of authentic wrestlings, convenings around issues, and then bringing global community together to really study and solve it. So we are not looking to export any, again, silver bullet answers or, white American answers, to the rest of the globe. We want to platform localized conversations. We want to platform and elevate localized conversations to discover the solutions.
I think that phrase is a perfect way of couching it, Emily, platform local conversations. And, as we've been thinking about even just the architecture of what's required of this platform system, looking at how do we create this so that it has a global architecture in people steering it. So having, East Africa chapter and chapter leaders, and West Africa chapter and chapter leaders, so that they are making sure that the relevant conversations from their countries, from their cities, from their regions are elevated up with a group of people who want to be part of those conversations. And for many of us, we want to be part of those conversations. We have a lot to learn. I think the United States has a ton to learn about community, the concept of community. From Africa, from Latin America, from other parts. So that is our hope, but that means, the engagement of people. And so the Builders Network becomes people who you are reaching out and inviting when we launch publicly to make sure. And then even among our own networks, the majority of my network is actually people from outside the Western world, just because of the work that I did at Eastern University. And as I've talked to them about these ideas, there's a lot of excitement about people being part of that and starting to see how they can own what that would look like, utilizing this platform technology, knowing that they've got a critical mass of sisters around the world behind them, but what that could look like for them regionally. The research part of that you raised is a challenge. And that's why, we don't do research lightly. We think long and hard about how are we going to approach this. Does it need to be more targeted research based on lived realities in different parts? So, and Emily and I have talked, and we've talked with our African American sisters here in America. There are very few. There's not enough African Americans around the table in our NGO sector in the US. And we've had long conversations about why that might be, but we are hoping that this space starts to break down that barrier and starts to change that reality. But it means people having to engage initially into a space that might not be the first place they pick, but that's the way we're going to start to build a community that looks different than the communities we've experienced in the past.
Yeah,
So
Carla,
question?
well, I'd love to hear wisdom back from you, Carla, and how this reflection with you sits. So I just want to cue that up, if you don't mind. But let me say one other thing before we ask you to come back and share there. I have a hypothesis, and I'm going to go ahead and put it out. You'll not find it on the website, but I have a hypothesis. Like, if we can really get critical mass of conversation of women in the Christian relief and development sector, we can shift the needle on gender, but we can open the door to many other conversations that currently are not as comfortable in the Christian relief and development space. And I'm very careful to say Christian relief and development from secular relief and development with US headquarters. I think there's a deeper progression. I think there's more evolution and willingness to have the hard conversations about race and white supremacy and so forth in the secular relief and development spaces. I think it's still really, really hard. There's a barrier to entry on those conversations in the Christian relief and development sector. But I believe with a critical mass here, we can open other channels of conversation and influence broader change. I'm going to share this too. I'm a Disney mom. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we see a lot of Disney. And my favorite quote applied to this whole effort, and I'll just put the card on the table. In Mulan, there's a quote: "Properly applied, 4 ounces can move 1,000 pounds." Properly applied, 4 ounces can move 1,000 pounds. And I just, as Beth has said, if we were to unpack all of kind of the spirit leadings and steps on this, we believe God's in this effort. That's a conversation for another day, just the Ebenezers of this work. But we want to work smart to open the gateway to not just gender conversations, but other conversations that need to happen. So I'm just, in transparency, disclosing we have a lot of big vision for what God might be doing here. We want to be faithful stewards and hold it loosely. But all that said, Carla, how does that strike you, given your expertise, your experience, what you're plugged into, what we've shared about how we localize conversations and dynamics? What's triggered for you as we've processed that?
I think the first thing is I like the fact that you've specifically said basically US-based organizations versus, because there is a very specific dynamic that is within, based on the history of, frankly, of our country. And I think it isn't, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I'm going to use the term African Americans because I think people of color is a bit broad and they're different groups and how everybody perceives that is different. So from an African American perspective, given the history here, there is a major safety issue that is always at play. And so many people, when they get in an organization, the first thing on their agenda is how to navigate that environment. And so to have people come forward and be transparent there is a risk factor that they're often going to feel that they are managing, right? So I think that's just sort of a fundamental challenge that is on the table. Even with all the diversity efforts and DEI being, going up in organization, at least I haven't done data and, run any statistics, but I know from just the people in my network, most of the people feel like people are ticking off boxes versus really moving forward and doing the hard work, right? Because it is hard work to talk about one's personal bias and all of that. So I think it's really good to be focusing on the US because that image is what trickles down locally or whatever, because that's going to set a framework for what those, whatever those chapters or however that structure happens, there's going to be some kind of framework that goes down. I think the reason I'm pointing this out now is because I think it's important from the beginning in your DNA for this to be a part of it, right? For this question about people of color and all of these different groups, how from the beginning, if I don't want to say they feel representation, but sort of the safety issue is not addressed from the beginning, you're already starting from a place that's questionable, that's hard to pull back from, right? Because the designers are doing the best they can, right? These initial people, including me, we're all doing the best they can. That doesn't mean that you are responding to those types of historical fears that are just generationally embedded. And I don't have an answer to that. I just wanted to bring it to the table, that I think it's something to explore. And for me, if you're talking about contributing, I think that's an important piece that always, and especially if you're talking about diversity among certain groups, you're going to, the perception is always, not always, but often historically women have benefited from this type of stuff, and it has left other groups, I'm sorry about the wording, but maybe feel sidelined. And so how to manage that from the beginning. And I think that should be kind of a running theme from the beginning. I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm really responding to your question.
No, that's great, Carla. I just wanted a little bit of back and forth just to hear how you're processing. No, and thank you for bringing that forward. I will say we have a few individuals on the Tearfund USA team who have called this out similarly from the beginning. And again, we don't have the answers. We don't have all the answers. But I'm not satisfied at stopping just because we don't have the answers. Like I want to lean in to the questions and bring more people around. And say, how can we honestly discuss this? How can we birth something new? How can we create a different space? So I sincerely thank you for raising it and say, like, this is exactly the kind of conversation we want to have. And especially in this phase, this proof of concept, this pilot phase, to chart waters going forward. So thank you, Carla.
Carla, are we able to follow up with you after this call as well to continue the conversation on how to moving forward, how to make sure that it doesn't become just one of the things, that's nice that we talked about it, but how do we
DNA it,
systematically structure it as a central part, because you're not the only person that would be feeling that for sure. And it's not our hearts,
No, absolutely. I mean, this for me, I think it's important to be full transparent. I've been obviously in the NGO sector for a long time. And so again, sort of post George Floyd, it's a big part now of who I am, right? So I feel that I have to be true to that and not, you're always diplomatic, but there's sort of a scale of diplomacy that we use. And so I've become much more of a voice for this issue. And I just know that it's not a thing. It's not an easy issue to tackle on any side. Right. And so, issues that people feel, microaggression and all that, it's a reality. And it's never concrete. It's never something that's easy to measure, all of these things. So it's there. And I just say that to say, for me, I'm also searching of how do I be that voice? How do I have this discussion, even though it may not be safe? And what are those implications if you're having this discussion, even though you don't feel safe, right? So, I would be happy to have the conversation offline or further.
On our prayer of prayers, is that this community becomes a place where you feel safe, that safety isn't just assumed on the entry. Safety is navigated and negotiated and testing the waters and seeing the responses and, building up, okay, that was safe. Okay. And we all kind of experience that anytime we enter into a new group, but absolutely, historically marginalized groups feel it even more so. And so our hope is that this becomes a place that is safe, but recognizing you're going to get, the broad spectrum of people who understand the questions differently, but that's what this learning community would be about, is to helping bring us all along. Thank you for raising that. Courtney and Jacqueline, any thoughts questions or anything that came to your mind as you were listening to us or as you were perusing the site in these, first early weeks?
I don't have any initial questions. Yeah, I'm just excited to be a part of this.
What makes you excited? When you saw that, you're like, woohoo! What made you woohoo?
Yeah.
or was it, it's free. It's a year. I'll test it out.
So I work at Compassion International and I've been here a year now. And so Sarah Brackbill was actually my mentor when I started at Compassion. And so yeah, just ever since I started, I've always been one looking for professional development opportunities. And then I'm also always trying to network with the women who are in leadership at Compassion. So I just strategically, I'm like, who do I need to be talking to that's in leadership, who is woman and who is representing us well? And so that's kind of just been my heart. And so it ties those two together very nicely. And so it was just a natural fit. And I think Sarah included me on this, just knowing that that's kind of my heart, and we've had discussions about it. And so that's what excites me about it.
Great. Excellent. Thank you for that. How about you, Jacqueline?
Oh, wow. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is, I'm very fresh, so I am excited. I think that this is a much needed platform as a whole. I think that given the statistics, but also I'm a student, and so I'm going through the process of diving into NGOs, into the world platform. And I think there isn't a lot handed out, and there isn't an opportunity, especially for women. I also work with my church, and my church went from not allowing women to be in leadership to now we have a female pastor, and we have a whole different world. And so my heart is invested in women and building up women globally, but also within the local church, wherever that may be. I suppose I have a question of what theologically, what direction, when we talk about restoration, what are the goals within that restoration? Because it is kind of convoluted, and it's great to have a wonderful resource. But what is the goal in that? And I think actually kind of tying into what Carla mentioned about creating safety in that, there are some ways and some opportunities that biblically we can kind of create a grounding for that. I just didn't know if there was something specific to your hearts or specific to the intention moving forward, if there was any more expansion on that.
Beth, do you want to lead off? I'm assuming there are ties to DAI and CVE in that.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously we've reached out to partners who have been part of also the Wheaton Consortium. And so when you go and read the principles on our site, those were developed by the 20 of us that Emily referred to as the think tank. And you'll notice the first, I think it's one or two, that speaks to a theological understanding of women in the kingdom of God. And so when I think of what are our goals, I want every woman to know that she is God's beloved, and not just know it in head, and not just know it because Pastor preached it last Sunday, but know it in her heart. She is God's beloved. She is created in his image, and he calls her for whatever calling he has put on her heart, whether that's preaching the gospel every Sunday from a pulpit, or vice president of finance in some NGO, and knowing it at that deep soul DNA level. And with that, knowing that, beloved, we experience that healing that comes in restoring what the world says is women's worth. And that can be anything from the images that women have seen of themselves in magazines that says you've got to be airbrushed to be valuable, to the meta message in churches that have no women ever teaching or preaching that says you don't bring that value, even if God has equipped you for it and put it on your heart. And so trying to combat and come against the world's messaging for women and girls is what I think is our goal, coming away with a restored identity of who we are in Christ and in all the ways that Jesus engaged women intentionally and in significant ways, and that he engages us just as much today. Any other thoughts you have on that, Emily?
No, I think that's great, Beth, in terms of the heart and the ethos. Maybe just the one thing I would add on is, Jacqueline, we don't, I mean, that's absolutely the ethos. I think we want to walk forward in community to get it tighter than that. Versus, again, we would be at fault. Well, I don't mean that in any negative way, Beth. I mean, our spirit has been, let's not predetermine as a subset of people what everybody needs. That's all I'm saying is we would be not serving the community well if we conference room assume what everybody wants or needs out of it in terms of outcomes and specific activities. That's why we need the community. That's why we need you guys in the Builders Network to exchange ideas on this and say, yes, this seems right for the broad global audience we're targeting, or this might be right for a subset. And then how do we really hone in on that specific element of change and the right things to bring it about? So we need the broader community to help us make the right choices. I mean, punto. I speak Spanish. Full stop is what I would say right there. Like full statement right there. We need the community to make these choices together. So again, that's why you're here, and we welcome you.
Yeah.
And Beth, I am noticing time. So
I think that's a great place to end on.
Perfect.
That's our hope.
Yep.
That you are going to be speaking into all of these areas and helping us build this community.
Yeah.
It's important work. It's a big calling, maybe a little more than you thought you signed on for, but God is always one step ahead of you. You are not here by accident, but by his design for such a time as this. And so we welcome you, and we will continue the conversation in many, many ways.
Yeah.
So blessings on you as you go about your day, as you go about your week. Celebrate, continue to lift up the sisters around the world as we honor International Women's Day next week. And we look forward to seeing more of you out on our Alliance platform. Yeah.
Thank you all for your time. God bless, and we'll keep the conversations going. Yeah. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.